Welcome to the Cwic Media Come Follow Me series. In this episode, we are covering the Book of Proverbs and the Book of Ecclesiastes. These two books have as I see it, a very strong relationship one to another. We're going to show you how that works together. In the Book of Proverbs, you see this praise of wisdom, right? Wisdom becomes a real big deal. And there's a lot of things about wisdom that are very interesting. Wisdom is associated with the temple. Wisdom is associated with the anointing oil, the oil of wisdom. The wisdom is associated with the divine feminine. A lot of very interesting things that come with wisdom in the Hebrew text. Then we move over to the Ecclesiastes, and we have then kind of this pushback on wisdom. It's kind of like you've gone through and you've pulled back the onion layer. And once you have wisdom, then you pull it back and you say, this isn't enough. In fact, things become very nihilistic for the author of Ecclesiastes. And life is futile, life is vain. In Hebrew, it's actually the word vapor that is used. It's just a mist, it's nothingness. But it kind of moves from this great praise all the way over to this nihilism and skepticism and futility with wisdom and all of life. And then at the very end of the Book of Ecclesiastes, it comes back and talks a little bit more about judgment and redemption. So we'll show you how these two things work together. One thing that's interesting is that the Book of Proverbs and the Book of Ecclesiastes are traditionally assigned to Solomon, right, as the author of these two books. It's unlikely. He may have authored some of this, but I'm going to say it's unlikely. I think that you have, backing up again, going back to the previous book of Psalms, which is attributed to David, which is also unlikely for the majority of it. And now you move to Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, which are attributed to his son, King Solomon. It seems to me that there is something going on here with the kings. And since we know at a minimum that the Psalms were used as the temple drama during the fall festivals, right? Again, going from Rosh Hashanah, the New Year's, and the Feast of Trumpets beginning off, and then moving into the temple drama, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, all in the fall. We know that at a minimum, the Book of Ecclesiastes was read and still is read today by the Jews, but it was read anciently as a part of the Feast of Tabernacles. So the Book of Psalms, the Book of Proverbs, the Book of Ecclesiastes, these wisdom books, so to speak, part of the Ketuvim, are all seemingly part of these fall festivals. And so you have the title of Solomon here that may be more along the lines of the wisdom being attributed to him, but maybe the king is talking about these things, right? And even though the assigned date on this, especially the Book of Ecclesiastes, doesn't come until much later, we don't know about the oral traditions, we don't know about the drama, we don't know what might have been spoken in these festivals. There's very limited information, and so just a thought there, right? That these three books, Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, may all have played a part in the fall festivals. So moving to the Book of Proverbs then. Come in here and just starting off with verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, right? So we get this kingly assignment to this wisdom. Now, Proverbs, interestingly enough, comes from the Hebrew word mishal. And mishal means something to the effect of a similitude. Something in the similitude. It's like a simile. As, right? This is as that. Or we can even move into metaphor on this. Or symbolism. And so you can look, for example, at the parables that Jesus teaches in a way as mishalim or mishlim. I'm not sure how you would say the plural of that. But it's something very similar, right? Because what he's talking about is a similitude of life placed out in a likely fictional story with eternal principles within it. And so this is spiritual speaking. This is spiritual literature. This is spiritual language that we get here. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words, DBR, of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, and judgment, and equity. So taking in all of this wisdom and instruction here, this is what the book is about. It's going to praise the idea of wisdom. And all of these other things, justice, judgment, equity, not the way we use the term equity today, but that would mean fairness and equality, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man, knowledge and discretion. And so there's this coupling of the young man, speaking to a young man, and the feminine wisdom that are brought together here. Now we see here in verse 5, a wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. Okay, so we start getting all of this support for the idea of gaining wisdom and learning and understanding and instruction. You can just see a king talking about this during perhaps the Feast of Tabernacles and going over this as far as things that matter in our own individual behavior and how this is part of a behavioral instruction to seek this wisdom to all those that are present there at the Feast of Tabernacles. Number 7, and this becomes important, the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord, the reverence for the Lord, humility to the Lord, to Jehovah, is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So you're foolish if you despise these things that this book is going to go over. In chapter 2, this is one of my favorites, these two verses, 10 and 11. When wisdom entereth into thine heart, and knowledge is pleasant unto thy soul, discretion shall preserve thee. It's an interesting word. Understanding shall keep thee. So these little things where we would have maybe a quote that we would use for and memorize, right? I used to memorize a lot of these Proverbs and a little bit of Ecclesiastes on my mission. And I had a list of these verses that, and including some of the Psalms, that I would read every night on my mission before I went to bed. And so it was just became part of who I was. And it was this idea of immersing myself into this wisdom is the way I looked at it. I wanted these behaviors. I wanted this to remake me in a sense. I felt like I needed to be remade for my mission. And so I had this list that I would use. And I think the name that I gave it at the time was something like the Underworld Navigator. And when I say the underworld, I'm talking about the what would sit in my subconscious as I went to sleep. Right, the Underworld Navigator is I think what I had the title of this page with all these verses on it. So, but anyway, moving down a little bit further, actually going to the next chapter here, chapter 3. This is probably the most famous proverb here that we get in 5, 6, and 7, or at least 5 and 6 in chapter 3. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. So these all have to do with the idea here of reverence to the Lord, fear of the Lord, and humility. And this is giving you wisdom, right? The humility gives you the wisdom. Down in 7, I love this one. It talks about kind of a tough love. It's like the currant bush that we get from Hugh B. Brown, right, in his talk, his famous talk. Verse 11, my son, despise not the chastening of the Lord. So this is part of wisdom. Don't despise the chastening of the Lord. As you go through and you read the scriptures and there's a cry for repentance to you on something you need to change in your behavior, right? Don't despise it. Neither be weary of his correction. For whom the Lord loveth, he correcteth. It's a very, very important piece of wisdom. Even as a father, the son in whom he delighteth. Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. So this fulfillment, this happiness, this wisdom, this instruction is all giving you meaning with these things. And so much, I believe, of what this is with this wisdom is an understanding of opposition. It's an understanding of relativity and context and values that we all receive. It's a matter of what do we value the most? What do we value next? What do we value after that? And so Lehi's statement of there must be opposition in all things, I don't think it's just something on the one end of the spectrum being bad and one end of the spectrum being good. I think there's all of these things in between. There is a values hierarchy that is very important to understand. And what is most important must always be at the top. And then what is next important, other very important things come down below that. But you never, right, reverse the order of the hierarchy that the Lord gives. That's a problem. That's where we run into problems, where we overemphasize judgment. We overemphasize compassion. There's a lot of things that we can place value on, kind of our pet little principles, and lift up over the most important things. Now, moving on to the idea of the feminine, the divine feminine, and how this is treated, this is really interesting. Let me start with verse 13 here again. Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding, for the merchandise of it is better than merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. Right? So it puts it at a spiritual level and a fulfilling level for the individual beyond anything temporal. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things thou canst desire are not to be compared unto her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. So I just kind of this idea in my mind is the queen, the queen of Israel here. And this is maybe she's playing this part. I don't know. But, you're talking about something in her left hand and in her right hand, kind of like a staff and a scepter, right? Or the globe and a scepter or a rod. This is royal speak here that you get. So that's kind of interesting to me. It's wisdom is personified by a woman. And then it goes on a little bit more here, and it says, length of days, let me move to 17. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. And then get this. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her. And happy is everyone that retaineth her. So the idea of wisdom and meaning and humility and reverence for the Lord and all these things that give you wisdom and context and insight and value and meaning in your life are being compared to here to the tree of life, the destination in Lehi's dream, which is the opposite of the great and spacious building. And the tree of life is temple imagery. So you can again imagine maybe the king and queen here at the temple going over these things, possibly, right? And here we get the opposite of the tree of life here in chapter 8, verse 13. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Hate's a strong word for us, but it's to despise evil, we might say, to shun evil. Pride and arrogancy and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate. And then we have in verse 15, this is also very interesting, or again, we're talking about the divine feminine probably here. In 15, by me kings reign and princes decree justice. So you couple the idea of wisdom with Solomon, right? And say, okay, well, this is the gift that he needed to be able to reign properly, although it doesn't end up working out, but to reign properly over his kingdom. But remember anciently also that it is typically what we see is the mother of the crown prince, right? The heir is the one who is involved in deciding who the next king will be, who the heir will be. We see this with Bathsheba and Solomon. We see this with Rebekah, with Jacob and Esau, right? She gets very involved and she ends up making the choice, so to speak. We see this with Sarah, between Ishmael and Isaac. And, it's just, this is, the woman represents the throne. The woman represents the throne. So again, in 15, by me kings reign and princes decree justice. By me princes rule and nobles, even all the judges of the earth. And then you get things like in verse 20, I lead in the way of righteousness in the midst of the paths of judgment. So you get judgment here, but you get righteousness. And this is the exact opposite of what you're about to get with Ecclesiastes. And then in chapter 11, again, verse 30, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he that winneth souls is wise. So, it's the winneth souls. What does that mean? Well, obviously that's about the plan of salvation. That is about using wisdom and the spiritual gifts of wisdom to be able to bring other souls to the Lord and to the covenant path. And then in chapter 12, verse 4, a virtuous woman, which is wisdom, because you get some of the comparisons here with an immoral woman as well. But a virtuous woman, being compared to wisdom, is a crown to her husband. Remember, women are the throne. But she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. Okay, so in many ways here, the woman maketh the man, so to speak. And then we're going to get this, and this is important when we move into Ecclesiastes here. In verse 23 in chapter 14, in all labor there is profit. Right? Labor has meaning. It's not just profit of money or gain temporally. It's in yourself. It's improving yourself. Being productive is important. There is meaning in it. In all labor there is profit, but the talk of the lips tendeth only to penury. So that's, talk is cheap, basically, right? Talk is cheap. Here in verse 3 of chapter 16, commit thy works, so labor, unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established. So your what you think about, right, because of your labor, if it's committed to go toward the Lord and on let's talk about the covenant path and righteousness, then there's meaning to you, right? Up here, there's meaning to you in this. We get some other royal speak here in verses 11 and 12. A just weight and balance are the Lord's. Remember, think about the balance that has to do with judgment in the last day. See this also in Egyptian religion. All the weights of the bag are his work, right? So that's the grace that he gives in the higher law. Verse 12, it is an abomination to kings to commit wickedness, for the throne is established by righteousness. Okay, so again, where the king is supposed to be the emissary of Jehovah and even acts as Jehovah within the dramas, the throne is established by righteousness, and the throne is represented by wisdom. Righteous lips are the delight of kings. The wrath of a king is a messenger of death, but a wise man will pacify it. And we move on and on here with some royal discussion here, or some royal verbiage. Verse 18, pride goeth before destruction. So you have wisdom and the fear of the Lord on one side and pride on the other, just like Lehi's dream. And an haughty spirit before the fall. Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before the fall. Better it is to be of an humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. In verse 24, very interesting if you've ever read the non-canonical work of Joseph and Asenath. Pleasant words are as a honeycomb. The honeycomb represents priesthood and mysteries, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. Okay, then in chapter 5, we get this in verse 1. These are also Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied out. So you would see that Hezekiah, is he the scribe or is he the deliverer of these things, right? Being that he is the king. That's the way I would see that, right? Verse 2, it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. So this goes along with, okay, I'm the king and I am going to espouse, in some ways we can literally think of it that way, but I'm going to espouse wisdom. Okay, so we get kind of a general idea of what's going on here with the book of Proverbs, and we could call it the book of wisdom, right? The book of the king's wisdom, almost. But it's about meaning. It's about pursuing wisdom. It's about adjusting your behavior for a richness of life, for meaning that is gathered through humility. It's gathered through fear of the Lord, and pursuing this wisdom and instruction, as opposed to pride, right, on the opposite end of that. And of course, that wisdom is given a mishal, so to speak, of a similitude of the tree of life, a temple imagery there. Now we get to Ecclesiastes here, which is another word for this is preacher, the preacher, also assigned to Solomon. And this book was certainly and is certainly read at the Feast of Tabernacles. Very interesting, right? So let's see what it says here in verse 1. The words, DBR, of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Well, of course, the preacher here is the king. And so you can imagine the king not just writing something down for everyone, but actually delivering this, I would imagine, during the Feast of Tabernacles. And the son of David is not just Solomon, in my mind. The son of David is the Davidic king that would have played in the 8-day drama along with the queen and others that were acting in that drama. Just food for thought there. And then we get this, and it's a drastic change from what we had in this pursuit of wisdom, right? And then we get this in verse 2 of Ecclesiastes 1. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. In other words, there is nothing. It's nihilism, right? And there is no meaning. Nothing matters. This is all a vapor. Everything here is, there's no substance to anything. All of life, all of existence is simply a vapor, right? Verse 3, what profit hath a man of all his labor? See what we got in the book of Proverbs? It's now that you're getting kind of this yin and yang on wisdom and labor and the themes that we pull from the book of Proverbs. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? That is the theme of the entire book until the end of Ecclesiastes. It's all for naught. One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to his place where he arose. So time moves on. But what about the people on the earth? What about them? Well, it's all vanity. Nothing means anything. In verses 12 and 13 and beyond here, it says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. Now here you get kind of this idea that many have, and maybe it's true, it doesn't seem like it is to me, but where you have Solomon in his youth is writing the Proverbs, and then Solomon in his later life where he has kind of abandoned everything is now writing Ecclesiastes, and nothing means anything to him, right? I still think that this is something that is played out by the kings. And there's more of a yin and yang on wisdom that ends up the way it should be toward the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom. It's teaching us something here concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail or work or labor hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. Right? So what is the point of labor? Is what he's asking. He's moved on to the point of receiving all of this wisdom. And this is the king. This is you. Right? He gains all this wisdom, and now, as the learned would oftentimes think, there's no meaning to anything. And the more learned we are, there's this difficulty of being able to keep up the value of meaning in life. Right? The learned think they are wise. So as we go out and we gain this wisdom, we lose, unless we effort with it, we lose perspective on meaning. And that's the default position. It's kind of like the idea of saying that Jesus talked about when he said that it's tougher for a wealthy man, a rich man, to get to heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Well, you can say the same thing. Their wealth is given in many ways. There are riches, there are temporal riches, there's wisdom would be riches, right? And so it is hard for you to learn and to grow and to receive these things and then keep yourself up spiritually. That's not an easy thing to do. That's part of the plan. So oftentimes we go out and we learn and we learn and we learn. We bring in all these new ideas from college and all these other places, and all of a sudden we know better. And we can lose, right, that spiritual side of thing, that we can lose real, true wisdom and think that we are wise. But we're not. We're just knowledgeable. And there's a very big difference there. Of course, knowledge without that spirituality is simply going to lead to pride. The preacher, the king here, goes on and says, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. You can see how someone can get bitter and bitter with more learning. We want the learning. The learning is imperative, right? Intelligence, knowledge, these things are imperative, but it brings us up to a higher level of responsibility for our agency and for our testimonies. He says, I communed with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate, and have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly, because that can come along with it. Genius brings along madness and folly if you're not careful. I perceive that this also is vexation of spirit. To know this much and to have all this wisdom requires more personal responsibility, more spiritual responsibility. For in much wisdom is much grief. The more you know, the more grief there is. And that's true. And that goes not just with knowledge, like for book knowledge, historical knowledge, whatever that is, but it's also experience, experiential knowledge. The more experiential knowledge you have, the more grief there is. But in the right perspective, the more joy there is. He says, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. So again, I mean, that elevation on both sides has got to keep up with each other. What happens when we gain more knowledge, or we find new ideas or new ideologies, and we don't stick firm with the wisdom that's already been given to us, perhaps by our parents or by others that we have followed, and it's good wisdom, right? It's true wisdom. What happens when we don't hang on to that? Well, that knowledge leads to more sorrow. But not only that, right? It's life's knowledge, life's experience is going to lead to more sorrow. You know this if you have kids and grandkids and friends, and you've gone through life for a while, right? The more experience you have with this with life, you're going to have more sorrow, but you can also have more joy. The preacher goes on in chapter 2, verse 10, and whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor. And this was my portion of all my labor. Okay? My heart rejoiced in my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought. So now I'm looking back, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. So again, what is happening here is the idea of I'm going to adopt this knowledge and make it mine. Instead of looking outside of myself and for the spiritual gifts and the spirit and what is given to me through what I would call the DBR, right? That is given from God. It's now only I am owning this. Right now I own this knowledge. It's not given to me by God. It's my knowledge, and I will make my own choices. Well, that's going to lead to vanity. And then this is interesting in verse 13. Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth darkness. So how does light excel darkness? Because light comes in and disperses darkness, right? But where there is light, darkness goes after it. We know this through our own experience on earth. In 17, therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. This is a very troubling thing. Yea, I hated all my labor, which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. And then he brings this up, and he's trying to, he's battling here with this. He says, there is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, that it was from the hand of God, being productive and laborious. Laborious is the wrong word, but to assign your work, as we saw in Proverbs, to the Lord and in his ways, then that is, that comes from God. That has meaning. Now we start to get a little bit of a turn in this from the preacher as he starts to talk about righteousness, in a sense. In other words, assigning your labor to God, that there can be meaning, that these things do come from God. In verse 16 and 17 here in chapter 8, when I applied mine heart to know wisdom, and to see the business that is done upon the earth, for also there is that neither day nor night with sleep with his eyes, then I beheld all the work of God. A man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, because though a man labor to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, further, though a wise man think to know it, yet shall he not be able to find it. In other words, you behold the work of God, and what you learn, what you have, is nothing compared to what the knowledge of God is, right? All the work of God, all of your work is not going to bring you to the level and knowledge of the knowledge of God. And you've got to keep that humility and that context in place. So he continues to make kind of this turn here, and then we get to the last chapter in chapter 12. And we get this in verse 1. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. So this is what he's been talking about. There's no pleasure, there's no meaning in all of these things. When that happens, remember your Creator. Remember God, right? While the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. And then we get down here toward the end here, starting in verse 10. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. So he sought to find the right words. The words of the wise are as goads. This is like what you would use, the sticks against the oxen to make them move, right? and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. So you can, in other words, knowledge is abundant. You can get as much knowledge as you want, right? You can seek as much knowledge as you want. You can seek as much wisdom as you want. But you must fear the Lord. You must have humility to go along with that. If you do not keep those even, you're in trouble. And so he finishes off here in the last two verses by saying, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. So what does this all mean? And I think we need to go back to Proverbs to start off with the conclusion of this matter, right? Which is the matter being, seek after wisdom. But it's not enough to have the wisdom. You must retain your fear of the Lord. You must retain humility. You must retain your dependence on God. Verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So seek after wisdom, pursue it with everything you've got, but at the same time, keep your humility. Hang on to the principles of the gospel. Hang on to the doctrine of Christ, which is primarily to me the condescension of God under all men, all women, right? And lowering yourself below all. It is the doctrine of Christ. It is the great and spacious building that wisdom will lead to, that knowledge will lead to, unless you retain that humility and the doctrine of Christ and proper wisdom, which is compared to the tree of life. Thanks for listening.